It was going to be an out-of-box build, but then I started making some changes. Not big changes, just little ones that I think most modelers would easily do themselves to lift the level of accuracy and detail of this kit. My build uses a mix of SMS, Tamiya and Zero paints. There's a number of scratch-built parts, mostly made from leftover scrap material, so there's basically no extra cost. This thing's got a modified exhaust system, added the fuel overflow nozzle, custom window net, heat shields have been added, window straps replaced, and some body modifications. Stick around and I'll show you all the steps to build the Grey Ghost. G'day everyone, this Salvinos JR Models Oldsmobile went together much better than the first one I did, which was the Richard Petty STP version. Being the same mould meant it still had the same issues, but the experience of the first build allowed me to take a different approach that sped up and simplified this one. There's about 130 parts in the box and a number of them don't get used. It's moulded in white plastic, but there's also clear parts for the windows, rubber tyres and a sprue of chrome pieces. The decals are by Cartograph in Italy and they are very good. The number 28s are made of a reflective mirror type material and they all go down really well. As usual, first step is to mark up the seams, mould lines and remove the flash from the casting, including the overly thick rear window retaining straps. Now, this is Salvino's first kit that they produced and they got the instructions wrong, illustrating here the assembly of a leaf spring rear end, which is not correct. Luckily, all of the parts that are required are in the kit to build other models, so it was just a case of building this one just the same as I did with the Petty car. I didn't bother to cut the fuel cell and the battery from the sprue because once the model's assembled you can't see these anyway. The rear window retaining safety straps were cut out and then the channel around the edge had to be rescribed. For this build I decided to do a lot more batching. Instead of religiously following the instructions step by step, all the parts come off their sprues and everything was all cleaned up before I started, and a lot of parts were assembled, such as the majority of the engine and the rear end and etc. And this really sped up the build. Same technique for the chassis. Here the roll cage and firewall are glued into place on the main floor, and then the back half is glued in place with the rear firewall and bar work. So it didn't take all that long to get to this position here where the majority of the internals had actually been built up. Although the top bars of the roll cage have been left off because access is needed to put parts in after the painting has happened. The door gaps are huge on this model. I used milliput in the gaps and then once that's hardened it can be sanded down smooth. A further modification to the main body shell was thinning the plastic around the wheel arches by carefully scraping with a hobby knife. Now, when the Salvinos Oldsmobile kit is assembled according to the instructions, it calls for 2 spaces to go between the diff and the trailing arms to set the rear ride height. The problem is, that makes the rear tiles foul on the inner guards. In the previous Petty build, I only worked that out at the end of the build and had to cut the tyre down to make it fit. But on this one, I've been able to pre-plan and make room for the wheel by thinning the inside of the upper rear section of the wheel arch. The rear spoiler in the kit is terrible. In the previous build, I made up a paper template and used that to create a new version from thin plastic. This time I took a bit of a different approach. I applied some masking tape to the kit's original part, trimmed around the edge, and then placed the tape on some styrene sheet and cut that out. I was then able to scribe a line along where the fold needs to happen and then bent that all up and fits onto the rear of the car perfectly. Then I glued it in place, but if you're going to do this, I would recommend you don't because it's too easy to get it damaged. And that's exactly what happened with this. I'd ended up catching on things and bumping it to the point that it actually started to tear and break off. Back to the suspension. The panhard rod does not fit the chassis rail and requires material to be removed so that it can sit flush. The Grey Ghost had a unique fuel tank breather / overflow that stuck up out of the left rear quarter panel. The kit doesn't include it, so I made one myself. This is made of several pieces of evergreen layered up to get the required thickness. It was then cut and filed to shape, and a small hole was drilled in the end for a piece of rod to insert to represent the overflow outlet. With the door gaps filled, I used some grey primer to help spot the unevenness so that can be corrected. This is a big batch of parts ready for primer. Now I used Tamiya's grey primer for all of the parts on the Oldsmobile, but for those of you who are paying attention, you'll see that there is a nose cone in there out of a Honda F1, and that got some white primer. The kit includes 2 different styles of wheel rim. The shape that better suits this build are chrome plated, but the car has black wheels. Now at this point in time, I had yet to work out how to strip the Salvinos chrome, because it's not the normal sort of chrome you get in other kits. So I hit the rims with Tamiya grey primer so that they could be painted, and then they were just part of a batch of black, which included the inner and outer halves of the wheels, the radiator, and there's also a cowling in there from a Honda F1 build. There's plenty of Zero Paints silver that I used on the Sauber Le Mans winner build. Now if you want to see that build with the weathering and the damage that I put onto it, there's a link in the description. But because it was left over of that paint, I decided to use that for the silver. It gives a matte finish when put on, but it comes to life once some clear goes over it. I'd hit it with some Tamiya TS13. The rear end assembly was sprayed semi-gloss black, and the trailing arms were then masked off so that I could then put some of the Zero Silver on the parts of the chassis and then just use a brush to finish off the detailed painting. As you can see here, I've not bothered to fill the ejection pin marks on the underside of this build. They're all over the place, and I wasn't going to go down that path. I've read about modelers using the textured foil from inside a packet of cigarettes to represent heat shielding. I used the sealing foil from a tub of butter, would you believe? But I've cut it up, bent it to the approximate shape, and used this as a cockpit foot mat. It's just glued in with a bit of crystal clear. Dashboard was sprayed semi-gloss black, and then the decals were put on for the gauges, and the switches were picked out with some chrome silver paint on a toothpick. But there is a mistake here, and I only noticed this later on in the build when it was too late, but the top surface of the dashboard in this car should be the silver body colour of the interior and not black like I've got it here. The chrome decal edges on the gauges really stand out well, and you can see here the shielding that I put in. I've also put some wash on that and scuffed it and pressed it down to make it look a little bit worn for where the driver's feet would go. The roll bar padding is just what the kit's moulded, and I've just painted that flat black, and the seat is also the kit stock item, and I've just painted the buckles, picked them out in chrome. So with some parts painted, start putting it together. The trailing arms and the diff fitted here. The rear shocks have been added, and I've put some oil stains around the underbody and the leading face of the fuel tank. But as with the Petty STP build, I've got no idea if the colours here are correct, as the kit instructions give no clue, and I've not been able to source any period correct photos. Added a push to speak radio button just with a dab of paint. Once the seat and the fire extinguisher and steering column etc. had been put into the cockpit, it was then time to be able to fit the top bars to complete the roll cage, and then moving on to installing the front suspension and the rest of the steering. The multicolour strip that separates the black sides of the body with the silver upper surfaces is a multi-piece decal. After painting the silver on the top sides of the model, I then make up a template to create a mask to do the sides. I take a photocopy of the decal sheet and then cut out those multicoloured stripes and tape them to the side of the body to get the fit right, and effectively create a paper template that I can then produce a painting mask from. So this is just creating the paper template, pieces of tape holding it in place. I then put some masking tape down on some glass and place the paper template on top of that, and then carefully cut around the edge of the paper to create a mask from the underlying tape. These are then carefully peeled off the glass and applied to the model, which is a bit of a pain to get them lined up, but once they're in the right position on the model, you can then tape off the rest of the body so that the silver does not get any black over it, and also seal off the underside as well so that there's no black mist leaking through the window openings. And I just mount the body on a piece of wooden rod. I find that much easier to handle than the Tamiya paint stand, for example. It was then a case of giving it a few coats of black. For this model, I used the SMS Jet Black Gloss, and this is it after the masking was removed. The black was then wet sanded to smoothen out the edge of the mask and also remove some of the orange peel. I haven't been able to get a really nice finish using the SMS black compared to what I've been able to achieve with the Tamiya black. Not sure whether there's an issue with the paint or whether there's an issue with my technique. The instructions give no instruction for the engine colour. I could not find a suitable period photo, so I just decided to go with my version of GM engine red. I basically eyeballed a bit of a mix of Tamiya orange and a dash of red, and the gearbox and bell housing were painted in aluminium. The kit has got rubber tyres. I sanded the tread surface to remove the seam line, then cleaned the tyres and applied the Goodyear decals. Once the logos have dried, I put a bit of Tamiya smoke over the tyres, and you can see the two tyres on the left, the logos are a little bit duller than the ones on the right. I then put a coat of SMS flat clear over the lot to take the shine off. So once the tyres were done, the wheels, which are in two halves, were then put together and glued in place. You can see through the wheel spokes here, the back of the rim has got a metallic colour. I just put that there to sort of a little bit represent a brake rotor. Here the lower control arms and the upright and the front axles are in place. Now in the previous build, the front axles were too short basically for me to get the width that I wanted on the front track of the car. So I used the longer axles that are provided in the kit. I decided to throw some basic ignition leads at this one. So I cut down and drilled the kit's distributor to take 8 leads, glued them in place, and then inserted them into holes I drilled in the cylinder heads. Got no idea whether this is accurate or not, but I thought it'll liven up the engine bay a little bit. The engine then receives some wash and the extractors go on so that it could then be dropped into the chassis. Now with the extractors, they are in a burnt metallic colour, and then I've just put a little bit of clear blue and yellow for some heat staining. The radiator is painted in SMS silver, but in its original state it does not fit in the kit, so the edges have to be cut down a little bit so that it can slide in. And here the radiator and the water pipes are in. The instructions call for the wheels to go on at this stage, but I don't fit the wheels until the body has been put in place so that I can get the wheels exactly where I want them. Back onto the body and getting some of the first decals on. Firstly, the coloured stripes that separate the black and the silver, and also the big number on the top. The decals are nice and opaque and they all went down really well, and it didn't really take that much time to get the decoration done. Once the decals had dried for about a week, I put clear coat over the entire body. I used Mr. Colour Premium Gloss Clear because I know Tamiya's TS13 that I usually use reacts with the Salvinos decals. It was done across 2 different sittings, starting off with misting and then light coats, a little bit of wet sanding to flatten out some bumps, and then a couple more light coats and a final heavier one. It then got another very light wet sanding, and then I went through the micromesh system stage by stage and finished off with Tamiya compounds. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't strip the chrome from Salvinos JR parts, because here's the evidence. You can. I soaked the bumpers and the grille in hydrochloric acid for the best part of a week, and this is the result. Now you need to be a bit careful with that sort of stuff, but it does allow you to clean up the mold lines and the sprue gates properly. All that's required to finish the underside now is the exhaust. Now the kit exhaust is incorrect. Salvinos provide a twin pipe dump that goes out the left side of the car only, and that's wrong. This car had a single pipe that went out each side. So I used the kit pipes as a starting point and cut them up, and then I made some new tailpipes out of some scrap sprue. So I've just got part of the kit pipes taped in place, and this is just test fitting to get the angle correct so that the pipes will exit at the correct location, and instead of having a blunt piece of plastic for the exhaust, carefully drill out the insides and make it hollow. The new tailpipes were then glued in place, and I used some sprue goo to fill in a couple of little gaps around the edge, and just test fitting it all before it was back into the spray booth. And finally, the last batch of primer, and it was all for parts that were going to end up with a metallic finish. There are 2 molded in raised sections in the front windscreen to replicate the intrusion straps. Now this car actually had 4 of them, so I just masked off an extra 2, one on each side. It was then back into the spray booth with some gloss black. And this is the windscreen after the masking was removed, but unfortunately the thinner ones that I did on the side have sort of now made this look a little bit weird. Here are the 2 windows. For the front one, I gave it a very fine coat of thinned clear blue because photos of the real car sort of give an indication that it used a tinted windshield. The black shading across the top, I just carefully did that with the airbrush, and it doesn't look too bad in the photo, but up close it is a little bit coarse. These are the new exhaust pipes, painted with SMS stainless steel over the SMS jet black, and these have come out really well. For the rear bumper, I masked and sprayed that tapered leading edge in aluminium, and then that was masked off and the rest of the part hit with chrome paint, which in this case was the Green Stuff World chrome metal. It looked fantastic straight out of the airbrush, but after a few minutes it did dull down a little bit, and I can only assume I've put it on a little bit too heavy and it started to react with the black underneath. It's not a really lustrous chrome finish that it was initially when it came out of the airbrush. All the window trim was done with bare metal foil, so here just getting the front trim started, and this is the rear trim after it's all been burnished down. The radiator ducting has been fitted to the chassis, the grille is now in the front of the bodywork, and the windows have gone into the body as well. Now the front window, it did initially fit okay when I was doing all the test fitting prior to paint, but that was months earlier than what this photo was taken, and by the time I got to put the front window back in the body must have readjusted itself and it didn't really fit all that well, so there is a bit of a gap across the top. Basically this is the last picture before the body gets permanently placed over the chassis. Even though I'm using the longer front axles that are provided in the kit, I still had to cut them down a little bit to get the wheels to fit under the body. And it's a similar scenario at the rear. The metal axle provided in the kit is too short, and if you use that and put the wheels, push them all the way on, it just looks ridiculous in my opinion. So I cut the axle in half, stick a half in each of the rear wheels, and then put that into the rear end of the car and space the wheels as close to the body as possible. I'm not sure how other builders mount the Oldsmobile body, but I just jammed the inlet duct under the nose cone cowl. It does require a bit of trimming of plastic to get it to fit, but once it's there, I then just use a dab of CA glue to hold it in place. So here we've got the body is glued in place, all four wheels are now positioned, and the pipes have also been added. This just illustrates the wheel getting it right out close to the bodywork. And because the top edge of the fender has been trimmed, able to get it out closer. You can see in photos that the real car had a metal shield on the body at the exhaust outlets, so I just used a small piece of bare metal foil and then gave it a bit of a light dusting of weathering powder to make it look like it's been in use. This is what happens when you don't pay attention. The oil cooler in the kit is made of two parts, but I mixed them up and accidentally put the thicker piece closest to the front wheel. This meant that there was not enough clearance for the front tyre, so I had to trim the edge of the cooler so that it could fit. The front and rear bumpers don't have any positive fixing points to the body, so I've used crystal clear to hold it in place. Now this might look a bit of an overkill here, but I've spread the glue around just to increase the surface area for it to take hold. Because I'd cut the rear window straps out of the body, I had to make up some new ones, so I just cut up a Coke can and made up these thin strips of aluminium. Because it was a Coke can, one side was an aluminium finish, the other side was red. When I was sanding them, I couldn't really get rid of the red properly because of the crinkles in the can, so I just hit it with a bit of Tamiya LP mica silver. The strips were then cut to length and just glued in place with a bit of super glue, with the paint side down and the aluminium surface to the top. I've then put a panel line wash around all of the window trim and also around the boot lid. This is the scratch built fuel breather that was mentioned earlier. It's just been attached with a bit of crystal clear. You can also see here the rear spoiler has been painted black and refitted. The rear spoiler here, I've just gone with black, but photos of the car raise a question in my mind because it does not look like a standard blade spoiler that the other cars ran. To me, it looks like the spoiler comes out of the boot and then kicks up further. So if any of you are experts of NASCAR in the 80s, throw a comment below and please explain, because I don't understand why this looks different to other cars in the field. Again, I decided not to use the kit window net. I just made one from a piece of mesh out of a wire door. Run some thin strips of Tamiya tape around the edges and then bent the net into shape so that it can just hang off the door. And then I brush painted it with a mix of flat white that had a tad of deck tan added just to create a bit of an off-white colour. And so what that means is the model can be displayed with or without both the bonnet and or the window net. Overall, this kit went together much more easily than the previous build that I did of a Salvinos JR Oldsmobile. Unfortunately, I did make some errors, but in both cases, totally my fault, and the message is pay more attention. So there you have Buddy Baker's Grey Ghost, the winner of the 1980 Daytona 500. If you like this video and you want to see some of the issues I had with my first Salvinos Oldsmobile build, go and check out the video here.